Denji's character arc is getting boring. Denji is one of my favorite characters. I was right there defending him when people called him a gooner or a discount Mineta. I always believed there was depth to his character. He wasn't just some pervy idiot, and Part 1 of Chainsaw Man made that clear. Even though it's obvious that Fujimoto has a thing for dominant women, he's literally said so himself, Part 1 never felt like it was just indulging in that fetish. The female characters weren't just objects of desire, they were messy, strange, and unpredictable, and the way Denji interacted with them actually meant something for his growth. That's what made Part 1 work. Denji was learning from his experiences, even if it was in small, messy ways. His dynamic with power, his realization that Riz wasn't just some dream girl, his complicated feelings toward Makima, even if he didn't always grow in a straight line, there was an arc to him. He had other relationships outside of women too, like Aki, which was crucial to his development. That's why his continued devotion to Makima at the end of Part 1 made sense. It wasn't a failure of writing, it was a tragic and realistic portrayal of abuse victims. But Part 2? It just doesn't hit the same. At the start of Part 2, things actually seemed promising. Denji was more mellow, still clearly recovering, but also showing growth. His dynamic with Asa in the aquarium arc was interesting. It felt like he was in a new role, a guide rather than just the guy being dragged around. He wasn't fixed, but there was an evolution happening. Then, suddenly, it felt like Fujimoto realized Denji still had to be the main character, even though his arc was pretty much finished, and instead of finding new ways to challenge Denji, Fujimoto just threw him back into the same cycle from Part 1, but worse. Every arc in Part 2 follows the same frustrating pattern. A woman tells Denji what to do, and he obeys. Something absolutely horrifying happens to him. Denji complains about how much he hates being horny and/or obedient. Sure, sometimes the order changes, but it's still the same thing. For over a year now. And yeah, I get it. Survivors regress. They go through cycles of healing and relapse. But this isn't regression with purpose. This isn't an interesting spiral. This is just repetition. Denji's interactions with women in Part 1 felt like he was slowly, painfully maturing. He would make mistakes, but he was learning. Here, he's just stuck. Denji's suffering is turning into a joke. In Part 1, the abuse Denji suffered was taken seriously. Yes, there were darkly comedic moments, but when he lost people like Aki and power, the story let you feel that pain. Even Denji's relationship with Makima, as twisted as it was, never felt like the series was laughing at him for being groomed. It was tragic. Now, Denji's misery is just a punchline. Take Yoru. She's clearly meant to be a comedic contrast to Makima. Where Makima was cold, calculated, and terrifying, Yoru is awkward, impulsive, and kind of pathetic. And I do find her funny, but it also makes it harder to take Denji's suffering seriously because when Denji gets manipulated again and again, it doesn't feel like a meaningful extension of his trauma. It feels like we're just watching him be Fujimoto's punching bag for comedy's sake. The infamous handjob scene is a perfect example. I think it was assault, but I don't think Fujimoto intended for it to be read that way. It wasn't some deep commentary on how male victims cope with abuse, it was just a joke about Denji liking it. The same way we're meant to laugh at him for constantly being put in degrading situations. And sure, Chainsaw Man has always had a cruel sense of humor. But in Part 2, it's starting to feel exploitative. The other issue is that the suffering in Part 2 isn't just repetitive, it feels cheap. The deaths of Nayuta, the dogs, the cats, it all felt excessive. And not in the way Chainsaw Man usually is. Fujimoto has always been brutal to his audience, but there's a difference between meaningful tragedy and just throwing shocking moments at the wall to see what sticks. When I saw those deaths, I didn't feel devastated. I just thought, oh, Fujimoto is over-relying on shock value again. The writing is going to get worse, isn't it? And unfortunately, yeah, it kind of did. At the end of the day, I just wish Part 2 stayed focused on Asa. If Fujimoto wanted to make Denji take center stage again, he should have given him something new to do. Something beyond just being stuck in a loop of suffering and bad sex jokes. At the start of Part 2, I would have fought anyone who said Fujimoto was using Denji as a vessel for his fetishes. Now, I still don't fully agree, but I also can't blame people for feeling that way. Because honestly, what are we doing here? Denji's arc in Part 2 isn't compelling, it's just tired. It's the same jokes, the same suffering, the same degradation, over and over again, and at this point, I don't think it's because Fujimoto is making some grand statement about male victims or trauma. I think he just thinks it's funny. And hey, maybe it is funny to some people, but for me, I just want something else.